Hey guys, welcome back to Integrated. My name is Angela Erickson, and I am so glad that you are here today. I sat down to talk to Kristin Molitor, who is a part of Grief to Grace. It's a retreat program ordered towards those who have suffered from trauma or are dealing with grief on some level and working through that. It's a 5-day program, and we just had a really great conversation about trauma and how it works in the body and obstacles that to people's healing. Like, how do we address those things? So I think it was a really great interview, and you're going to really like it. So God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Welcome to Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to bridge the gap between the intellect and the will so that we can grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. Hi, Kristin. Thank you so much for coming on to my podcast today. We're going to talk about grief to grace a little bit, but I do want to open up the conversation because, as I told you before we started recording, my goal with this interview is really to give something that people identify with and can see the broader conversation about grief. People are starting to learn more about grief, even just watching someone like Erica Kirk navigate these days after the assassination of her husband, that kind of a thing. But anyway, all that being said, would you mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved in Grief to Grace?
Sure. Well, good morning, Angela. It's nice to be on the podcast with you today and happy to share about grief to grace, grief, trauma, and really just about the human heart. So, I'm currently living in St. Cloud, Minnesota. I'm involved in a variety of different ministries, evangelization, Catholic speaking. And I'm also involved with the Grief to Grace retreat, which is located in a variety of different places throughout the country, but we are blessed to have one in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So my story with Grief to Grace really starts in 2020, and I was kind of processing the trauma of my own story and entering into the grief and pain of my own heart. But I didn't feel like I had the resources to do that, even in Catholic retreats and healing prayer. And I felt like I tried everything. And that can also be one of my own defense mechanisms because of trauma, right? You try and you try and you try and you try. And just like I just was pouring my heart out to the Lord, just asking for healing, asking for deliverance, asking for freedom, and just really not knowing what was next. So it was, I think, January of 2020. And one of my good friends gave me a call and she just said, "Hey, there's this retreat called Grief to Grace in Minneapolis, St. Paul. They're looking for a few more participants or they won't be able to run the retreat." So I looked up Grief to Grace and truthfully, Angela, it freaked me out. I'm like, oh, does this abuse, does this trauma, does this even apply to me? Right.
Mm,
And I think that's a good question
that's
because
one of my
sometimes,
questions for you.
yes, and we can talk about that later,
Yeah.
how trauma is very complex and it covers a lot of different areas. It's not just the one big event. But that was part of my story or part of my discovery of my own trauma and my own story. So she's telling me about this. I'm looking at the website. I'm like, I don't know if this applies to me. I had never heard of it before. But through a lot of prayer, I just took the leap of faith. I wrote the checkout and I showed up at Grief to Grace and it rocked my world. And
Hmm.
it opened up the deeper places in my heart and this journey of healing and discovery of my own trauma. And it gave me tools and resources that I really needed to get through those places in my heart. So, Grief to Grace was started in 2005 by Dr. Theresa Burke, who's also the founder. She's a psychotherapist and also the foundress of Rachel's Vineyard, who works with post-abortive women.
Mhm.
And it was in working with these women that she discovered there was so much more than the trauma of abortion. There was a
Yeah,
lot of trauma that had happened to them before the abortion even occurred.
so
And in,
true. Yep.
so in 2005, she developed the Grief to Grace program to really address the wounds of abuse and trauma. It's a 5-day retreat. And what I love about it, it's integrated. So it applies the best of the psychological trauma informed sciences, neuroscience, somatic experiencing, processing, group therapy, um, and also as well, it's spiritual care. And I really think we need both healing of the body and the heart and the soul,
Mhm.
right? Because we are human beings. Jesus made us with a nervous system and implicit memories. And this was the first retreat that I felt like really cared for my body and my soul.
Right. Well, and I think that's so important because I know, for example, or first and foremost, I know that Grief to Grace it came highly recommended to me years ago, actually. And I just couldn't go away for 5 days. I have six young children. At the time, I had five, and my oldest was like eight or something, you know? And so leaving, and one of them was nursing. It was just like, yeah, I can't do that for 5 days right now. But I've talked to other people like the Burks over at the Avila Institute. I know you guys have a strong connection with the Avila
Mhm.
Institute. They highly recommend your guys' work. And I think this is the root of why, is because it is this integrated approach to healing the whole person, because our bodies do keep the score.
They
Would you
do.
mind talking a little bit more about that? Because I think people are just now starting to have this awareness that, like, yes, on a physiological level, whether you are sure that you experience trauma or maybe you're not sure, you experience some complex PTSD, that's something that is wired into your nervous system from an early childhood thing that was going on. Maybe you grew up in an unstable environment or
Mhm.
something. Even children who are orphaned in other countries end up coming here, and they might live with a really wonderful family. They still often
Yes.
struggle with attachment
Yes.
issues. And a lot of that is wired into our brains and our nervous system. So, can you talk about that? Because I think sometimes people think, like, well, trauma, like, you know it when you see it, kind of thing. Like, you should just
Yeah.
be able to know it.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question, a really good observation. There's a woman that I've really been enjoying her resources. She's a Christian therapist. Her name is Dr. Allison Cook. And she really talks about what trauma is and the effects of trauma. And so sometimes we think that trauma is the one time event, the thing that happened. And it can be, right? So it
Hmm.
can be sudden loss, it can
Hmm.
be abuse, rape, the one thing. And of course, our nervous systems, our body is going to hold on to that memory. But trauma can also be complex. It can be relational. It can be children having to attach to a caregiver where they really need the caregiver and the caregiver is unstable. Like sometimes the caregiver shows up, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're mean, and the child just cannot wrap their brains around how do I stay in relationship with somebody who I really, really need and I'm really vulnerable, and
Hmm.
yet they still hurt me.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is when trauma is unwitnessed. So I love how Dr. Allison Cook says trauma can really be defined as unwitnessed pain.
Hmm.
So when you're a child, and let's say your parents get divorced, or mom or dad leaves, or one of your parents is an alcoholic, if there's not somebody to witness the pain with you, to really say, I'm so sorry, honey, that must be really scary, if there's not someone to attune and connect to
Hmm.
you, you can start to build a story around what happened. Dad left and it was all my fault. I wasn't good enough. Or if a caregiver can be erratic in their temperament, like sometimes angry, sometimes kind, you develop a defense mechanism. If I'm
Hmm.
always good, if I'm always perfect, if I please and perform, I'll never get yelled at, right? So we develop these defense mechanisms too to keep us safe when we're children. So just to give you a broader scope about trauma, but our body will remember that unless the trauma is witnessed, received, where we can kind of digest what happens, where it can kind of leave our body, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
if it doesn't, if it's not processed, it just stays there. So what happens is the past can become present,
Mm. Yeah, you
right?
can like relive without even realizing it. There might be something that triggers you. And I hate using that word because it's so overused, I think, by people because I think we do live what do you think about this? I guess I'm not trying to interrupt, but I'm just thinking we live in a society that is very much we like to be victims.
Hmm.
And I think people use being triggered sometimes as an excuse to be a victim and explain away poor behavior. And I'm not going to say that um, being triggered isn't a real thing or that um, certain things are not ever justified, but I think often it's used as a crutch. How do we approach healing in a way where we're not solely fixated on being a victim, in a way that it becomes a crutch for us?
Yeah,
Is
because
that, do you see that?
I do. So in my involvement with trauma, we're the most trauma aware culture, which is
Yes.
it can at its best it can be very empowering. At its worst, it can be a crutch, as you said. So when people say, you really triggered me, or I don't feel safe, or I
Yeah.
don't.
I need a safe space. And it's like, do you? I kind of think you almost need an unsafe ideological space just to exposure therapy a little bit. And that's because words are not always real trauma, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. So at its best, trigger is a real nervous system response, right? And so I experience a lot of triggers. Now, the thing is at its best, the triggers are meant to be a pathway to healing, right? So
Right.
when
The
you're
system telling you like, hey, pay attention. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So when your body is reacting in a disproportionate response to a situation, in our own shame and flooding, we want to put the blame on the other person, right? Well, you did this and you did that, and it's your fault. And, there can be some truth to the harm that they're causing us in the present moment that needs to be addressed. But if we're actually triggered, and this happens to me, I mean, I'm actually triggered quite a bit. And maybe I didn't realize it until I've grown into the space of self-awareness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it used to always be about the other person. And I'm like, oh, this is something that's like
Hmm.
really, really close to my story, right? And so when we're triggered, it's the past becoming present. It's
Mm-hmm.
where our brain, our nervous system is picking up cues where it's thinking that the past, the thing that happened back then is happening right now in the present, right? So if there is an example where your caregiver may not have always given you the care that you need and deserved, right? So let's say like your dad was an erratic alcoholic. And that is such a pain for children to bear, right? But
Mm-hmm.
maybe next time you have a boss, right? A male boss who's in authority over you, and they come and they check in and they say, like, hey, could you correct this? Like your nervous system might just, you flood, go into overdrive. And he's such an idiot. He's such a jerk. He won't, he's so hard on me. And well, maybe, or maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And so what to integrate that experience is to help us come into our adult selves.
Right. There's that maturation that has to
Yeah.
happen.
To
Yes.
say, I am not the scared little girl under the couch anymore, hiding. Like I'm a grown adult. And it's that relationship that we can have our adult selves with that little child within us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you say that because there was like a year and a half there probably where almost every confession and it didn't matter what priest I went to, like I went on this silent retreat and he was saying the same thing that my normal confessor was saying. So I really felt like, okay, God is obviously trying to say something to me. And I don't know if I'm ignoring him or what, but I'm trying. I think too, you go into confession, you're like, same litany of sins that I'm confessing every time I go in. But he said, it's okay to tell that little girl that is still inside of you, that she's safe now. And I remember like being so overwhelmed by this sense, like, you're right. Like, I'm a 30-something-year-old woman now, and I'm in control of my life. I mean, insofar as um I don't need to cower anymore. The authority is in my, like, there are obviously things outside of my control, whatever, and there's that spiritual poverty, but I I have autonomy now. And so I don't have to live my life like I don't have autonomy, right? Like, there's this um part of growing up is having that, oh gosh, being able to self-direct in a way that you
Mhm,
can't when you're a
mhm.
child, because you are under someone else's authority. And two, you're just vulnerable as a child. Like, it doesn't matter if it's your parents or somebody else in your life that is causing problems. You just you don't have the power to really do a whole lot in your circumstances, and so you just learn to adapt and thrive and survive a lot of times. So um what do you think about this idea of attending to the child in ourselves? Because sometimes I wonder again if that could be a crutch where we're always like turning back instead of looking forward. You know what? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that we can, when as long as the past is still ruling us, right, it's hard
Right.
to move forward. And then sometimes we can just hang on to the past because it's safer, right? So that there are times where it can be a crutch, but I think that our emotions are always giving us information, right? They're always giving us data about our thoughts, our beliefs, our past, our present. Um, And so they are information, they're not meant to guide, govern, and rule our lives. And so I think that when we turn into the little child needing care, it's a way that we're actually practicing self-governance. It's a way of practicing moving forward, right? To say that I know in the past we didn't have these resources. I know in the past it was scary, but I'm here now and I
Mm.
can take care of you. And in that process, you can gain self-trust that really helps you move in greater freedom, autonomy, agency, decision making.
What are some signs that you are starting to heal? What are some unexpected signs? Like, for example, probably 8 years or so into my marriage, it was so weird because all of a sudden, all of a sudden, I think a lot of things that I had buried or seemed latent started to surface.
Mm,
And I realized later, I think it's because my nervous system finally felt safe because
safe.
somebody had been present and loved me unconditionally for 8+ years. And it was this first time where like there was somebody there that I didn't feel like I had to earn his love. But I felt undeserving still.
Mm,
But it
mhm.
was, it's like all of a sudden all that stuff that I had stuffed down for so long, it just kept bubbling up and I couldn't, it's like the gates just flooded and I couldn't keep it back anymore. And I almost feel like it's because my nervous system finally
Yeah.
on some level felt safe. Is that a common
Yes.
experience? Can
Yes.
you explain that to me?
I felt like that too, actually, at one point where
Mm,
I felt like healed and in control and all these things when really I was numb.
mhm.
Just,
Yes, that's
yeah.
exactly it. Yes, I was
Yep.
numb. Yeah.
Disconnected. Really, so my mom passed away in, a sudden car accident about 15
Mm,
years ago.
I'm really sorry for your loss.
Thank you, and I remember, it was hard, it was awful, but I remember just feeling really strong and really like, "Look at my faith, it saved me, and God's in control," and, um, saying some really pretty spiritual things. And it was really like in the last few years, I went through a major transition that brought up a lot of loss,
Mm,
and I was pummeled. So like the grief that was never expressed, the
mm,
grief I was too afraid to go to, the beliefs that I held on to because of that event, like all came flooding. And it was because I too was feeling safer in my nervous system. I had some supportive resources, but I was also out of my home environment, right? I was alone. I had more focused time on my heart. So and I remember during that time I was just kept thinking, well, I thought I was over this. Well, I thought I was through this. Well, I thought so just to, it's that thing of like it has to get worse before it gets better. And we think about that like when we renovate a house, right? We
mhm.
gut, we tear down, we like take out what's old and it's messy and you're living in this state of like incompleteness,
It's a
instability.
construction zone, right?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
so you're just kinda, like, walking over things, it's not comfortable, you just
Mhm.
wish that it could be in a more completed form so you could be at peace. So that's, like, the part that's messy, right? At Grief to Grace, we say we have to feel
Mhm.
so that we can deal and heal, and I think that we do so much in our culture to not feel, right? There's ways that we keep us safe. And again, sometimes you're not able to tolerate the amount of pain at that time, but
Right.
why are we scrolling so much? What's that keeping us from?
Mm.
Right? We're scrolling or we're binge watching, we're binge eating. Like there's a lot of behaviors that we do when you look at your compulsive behaviors, areas that you waste time, areas that you bring to confession. Sometimes a good question is to ask, like, what's the pain that I'm avoiding?
Mhm.
And so, to your point, Angela, when we talk about grief, right? You kind of opened up this podcast about the larger conversation about grief. Grief is an excruciating feeling. It's
Mhm.
really painful to like honestly acknowledge our loss. And grief is the feeling of love where there's nowhere to go,
I
right?
was just thinking that because it's one of my favorite quotes is that grief is love with nowhere to go, and I think that really hits the core of it, right? I actually I have a sister that passed away in a car accident on her way to my
Mm,
home. And so I relate a lot to that. It's different, obviously. A mother, I mean, it's different, but the suddenness of that type of loss.
yeah.
And I too felt quote unquote strong afterwards. I was um, doing committee hearings at the state legislature to make improvements on the road. I'm doing press conferences, and I'm sure people were like, looking at me kind of the way some people are looking at Erica Kirk and saying, like, how could she be doing all this stuff if she's really grieving, you know? But I think people don't understand a lot of that ties back to how your nervous system is wired and your defense mechanism. What are the things that you've trained in your brain? Which neurons fire the fastest, right? Because when you're doing something, when you're training your brain, those neurons fire faster. You're strengthening those connections. And I think we do that with our coping mechanisms, right? And so, and our pathways of thinking, um, and which is an important point that I want to talk about next is like the ways that we think about things. Um, if it's internal negative self-talk, that kind of a thing, you have to relearn how to wire your brain and change those neural pathways so that those negative ones are weaker and you strengthen positive thinking. Would you agree with that? And if so, like,
Mhm,
how do you recommend people do that? Because it is this whole body healing that has to happen. It's the nervous system, it's the brain, it's everything.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, when I first started healing, my healing journey, I just tried to do, like, positive talk thinking or positive talk, self-talk, because I have a pretty strong inner critic, right?
Me too.
Um,
Yes, I do too.
but that by itself wasn't enough. It's part of it, right?
Right. Oh,
But
yes.
but the trauma lives in our body, right? Usually there's, like, a wound, a memory, a painful feeling that's attached to it, right? And so it's really addressing addressing that as well. Like often, well, just recently, if I just were to share vulnerably, and so just going back to like that inner child work and this integrated healing, I was in my friend's car and she's on the Grief to Grace team with me. And she just said, and I'm going to tear up, it's very present to me. I said, I'm just experiencing a lot of anxiety right now. So just to pause there and say, in the past, that's where my inner critic would have showed up. And it typically does still. Why am I feeling this way? I always feel this way. I don't want to feel this way. I'm always anxious. And I would assume that a lot of our listeners can relate to some of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I have a lot of things to say. This is where it's really helpful to remember that the Lord made us for relationship and to need one another, right? Because left to my own devices, my inner critic is just going to go wild and just continue to beat on Kristin. Like, why are you so anxious? Like, you don't need to be anxious. You should be having fun. So just all this judgment of what I should or shouldn't be doing. But she was just like really helpful in the moment and said, oh, do you want to do a check-in? Right. So where are you experiencing it in your body? And I could just say like, oh, my chest was experiencing a lot of anxiety.
Tightening and heaviness. Yeah.
Tightening, a heaviness. And I kind of like went inside and I found, the belief, and it was really like, you're all alone. And I really started to feel that way after my mom died, right? Like, I wasn't prepared to live life by myself without her. And so that very much lives in my body. So this is where, when you're doing inner healing, if you wouldn't say something to a 5-year-old, then don't say it to yourself. Right? Don't. So instead of saying, you are safe now, Kristin, you are, right?
Calm down already. Every woman's favorite. Yeah.
You're in your 30s and you have resources. You're not alone, but to really just be with that part of my heart and to say like, I hear you, I'm with you, and I will never leave you. That was what little Kristin needed to hear. And so depending on how activated you are, positive thoughts aren't going to help. Now, when you're in a state where maybe I'm not feeling so activated, I can maybe start with I'm capable. I have resources. God has given me people in my life to help me, right? So, and maybe a more grounded state is when you can really start to integrate some of those positive thoughts. But if they become a weapon to a place inside your heart that's very vulnerable, it's not going to work. And Angela, one thing I really feel like it's important in our topic of grief to talk about, especially for those of us who are in faith-based communities, is this idea of spiritual bypassing. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes. Oh, well, just based on the language, I'm going to assume, let me guess here, it's going to say if you're not praying it away, you're not spiritually strong enough. Like you're doubting God and you have too little faith, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can be used as a way.
Spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it
To
is.
shame. But
Yep.
it's also a way that we bypass our emotions. So if in that moment in the car, what's the truth of my experience is that I'm experiencing anxiety. What I could have done to my friend to bypass, and she could have done this to me, was to say like, but God says, don't be afraid. You're not alone anymore. You are safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or when my mom passed away, she's in I'm just so glad she's in heaven and she's in a much better place.
Yeah.
Yes, I can get to that place, but only after grief. So what we want to do is we want to like bypass. So if this is like the painful experience that we're having in a moment, we can use a platitude to hop over that
instead of going through it, which is exactly what you have to do.
Exactly. And so I've led a lot of Christian women's small groups, Bible studies, book groups. I would say it's very difficult for us to not spiritually bypass, right?
Mm-hmm.
To instead of just attuning and connecting,
Because it's
and
painful and
yeah,
it requires a lot of work.
it requires a lot of work. And so I just feel very passionate about that, because we can really disrupt people's healing in our faith-based community, like when they want to come and be a little vulnerable about like what's happening, like their marriage that's struggling, their miscarriage, their children, whatever, right? And we come and we shame them for not being in a better place, right? Or we use a
Right.
platitude to push them into a place where they're not. And to remember that Christian hope, the virtue of hope, really only happens in a place of darkness, right? It's really, I'm grounded in my reality that this is hard and difficult, and yet God will do something instead of
Yes.
pretending like everything is okay.
Yes. I mean, because that's the truth in the crucifixion, right? It's not like Jesus was on the cross saying like, I'm not really feeling any of this. It's fine. I just need to
Right.
believe more in my Father. No, he experienced true pain and suffering. It's the same thing when Lazarus died. I mean, he experienced his death knowing that he was going to raise Lazarus back to life. And so, yeah, I mean, we can look to our Lord and say, yes, because we are incarnate, it's evident that we are meant to experience this on every level. And that doesn't in any way mean that we're not loving God enough or that we're not doing, again, it's that works based, like, I need to be doing something. I still remember this time leaving confession and having that realization, like, because I'm more of a perfectionist in things. That's one of my coping mechanisms, and realizing, like, oh my goodness, God just loves me. Period. And I was like, oh, I don't know. It was just felt like a revelation for me. Like, I can't believe that he just loves me and that I don't have to earn his love. It's still something I struggle with. Um, because I feel like I have that inclination. I'm like, I want to do this. I feel like I have to earn it.
Mhm.
And that's not the economy of God's grace. Thanks be to God, right? And it's the
Mhm.
same thing. Like, we're wanting connection and relationship. We're designed for that. We're designed for communion. And when people use platitudes to shut down how we're feeling, it drives disconnect.
It does.
Yes,
And so when we do that to ourselves, we disconnect from the very real places in our heart
right.
that needs love and care. And then when we do that with others, we're also disconnecting from them.
Do you think people do that because they're simply uncomfortable with
Mhm.
grief?
Mhm.
Do you think that's the root of it?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. Like, once you start to just look at your own patterns, it's this huge awakening, because we're all trying to stay safe. We're all trying to, um, our body, nervous system, we're trying to keep ourselves from pain. And so, really, if somebody doesn't want to hear about my grief, it's not so much about me as much as they want to stay safe, right?
Yeah,
They either haven't gone to those places in their hearts themselves, and so they can't tolerate my grief, or they don't even know they need to go to those places.
right.
But really, it's because we don't want to feel pain, and that's where, like, the other thing about the crucifixion, often when I'm talking about empathetic listening and compassion, that can really just be such a bridge to healing, right?
Mhm.
It's when I'm witnessed and received, and there's a nervous system next to mine that's like co-regulating me and offering me comfort that I didn't receive back then.
Mhm.
There's so much healing that happens, and I think about Our Lady at the foot of the cross, witnessing Jesus's suffering. Right. So she enters into this compassion means to suffer with.
Mhm.
And I can't imagine how excruciating it was to witness his pain, right? That was the source of her pain. She was not offering platitudes. I know this sounds like really silly, but what if she did say, like, well, we know God has a plan.
Yeah, that's that.
In a
Yeah.
few days,
And
like,
then
he'll
she
get
walked
better.
away. And then she
Yeah.
walked away from the crucifixion, right? Right?
Right.
I mean,
Like,
that's
just
what you would expect. If that's what God intended, then why was Our Lady at the foot of the cross? To suffer
right.
with her son. if she just needed more faith.
Right. And so, like, this courage to enter into these places of pain is really what can really lead to healing. And I think of the vulnerability of our Lord's heart, right? It's totally exposed and alive. So he's feeling pain and he's feeling joy. And we just cut ourselves off from these intense feelings, right? Intense feelings of grief. But when we cut ourselves off from that, then we cut ourselves off from feeling anything, which is joy and connection and relationship. And so, when you asked earlier, like, what are signs that you're healing? Signs that you're healing are also that you're showing emotion, that your hardened heart, your protected heart is opening to the experience of the moment, right? That you're able to shed tears and be joyful and present to your current reality.
I think too, there's no better feeling than to feel and know that you are seen, right? Like there is so much healing in that when you're with somebody and you tell them I'm struggling with anxiety right now, and they're like, I see you. And
Yes.
I'm sitting with you in this anxiety, and they're not judging you for it, because I think so often a lot of our wounds are rooted in just not feeling like we've ever been seen.
Mm-hmm.
It's very lonely.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
loneliness is, I think, one of the heaviest crosses to bear. Chronic pain is really tough, and loneliness is
And
really tough.
And why loneliness is so excruciating is because we're made in the image and likeness of a triune God who's a relationship of persons.
Yeah.
And John Paul II even said, man becomes the image of God not so much in the moment of solitude. So yes, each one of us is in the image and likeness of God, but more so in the moment of communion, in relationship with one another, right? And so to totally receive another person as they are, right? So maybe they're
Right.
experiencing anxiety, maybe they're experiencing nervousness before a test, or intense shame, or maybe they're experiencing anger. And to just connect and receive them as they are is so healing. And that can also be what's a healing balm to our own inner critic. If we've never experienced someone do that for us, it can be really hard to correct that inner critic, right?
Oh, yeah, or even to just have someone simply validate, like, "You're not crazy.
Right.
You're not crazy," and you're like, "Wait, I'm not? Because 'Cause I've been telling myself I'm crazy for decades," and people are like, "No, no, what you're saying, like, makes perfect sense." And then that does reframe how you see things, like, "Oh, I'm not crazy," or I'm not broken. Like, there's not something inherently wrong with me. There are things that need to be addressed, but it's not that I'm inherently beyond repair as a person. Like, what is it in the model for Grief to Grace? Like, how do you touch on all these different aspects throughout the retreat? Because I haven't heard of a retreat quite like this. And so I'm curious how that plays out over the course of 5 days.
Well, I would say one of the biggest healing aspects of the retreat is really the group work that we do together. So I don't want to give away the whole retreat, but there are ways that your story is witnessed and connected to in the presence of another,
Mm.
right? So we're able to share our stories or even share our current reality. What am I currently feeling or believing about myself? Even though there might be a place of shame to feel like I'm not worthy, I'm not worth it, I'm bad. We all have these negative core beliefs, but we don't, we just like to say, but that's not true, right? Instead of like really dealing, really.
Mhm.
And there's times like on the retreat where people just have tremendous breakthrough moments just by saying a core belief in the connection of another person
Hmm.
who's not fixing, who's not telling them something else, who's just really being present with them. So just entering into our shared grief, entering into the mystery of being the suffering body of Christ together is so powerful. And then entering into Jesus's story and our story and watching the Lord redeem that to something new is very, very powerful. So that would be like the faith element of it. But also, we do a lot of somatic processing. So, what's happening in your body right now? So, just exactly what was happening in the car, like an example, where
Mhm.
I could say, like, I'm feeling anxiety and it's in my body, it's in my chest. Well, what's your anxiety telling you? Like, pause, listen.
Mhm.
What needs to be witnessed? What needs to be addressed? So we do a lot of that. We do some exposure therapy as well, so things where we really might have felt frightened and stayed inside our shell for a really long time, um, to really open ourselves so that we can be seen and witnessed. We also like there are practical tools that we give our retreatants. We talk about like the 4 F's of trauma: fight, flight, freeze, fawn,
Oh,
right?
I'm so glad that you brought up, fawning because,
Mhm.
that is almost always ignored. I did not know that that was a trauma response until I was in my late 20s, and I mean, I that tends to actually be one of my responses, one of my primary responses, and I felt so much shame about that because it was always like, "What's wrong with you? Why didn't you fight back?" Or whatever. Can you talk about that for a lot of because I think we
Mhm.
grew up talking about fight or flight, and almost nobody has been talking about fawning, at least not while we were growing up. Maybe this is becoming more common in the discourse, but would you please talk about it? I think it's so important.
Yes. Oh, I love talking about the fawn trauma response because it's kind of a hidden response. So, like,
Yeah.
sometimes when we think that children are being obedient or they're so nice or they're so really, it's really compliancy out of fear, right? So, we
Hmm.
say fawn. The fawn is a baby deer. And what they do when they are under attack,
Duress, yeah.
they hide, right? They get really, really small.
Hmm.
And so we could say that the fawn trauma response shows up as um, really trying to appease and please those who are trying to hurt us.
Hmm.
So we walk on eggshells, or maybe it's like the example of a woman with an abusive husband. He comes in, he's being verbally abusive, he is being very terrible, but she just says, "Can I get you a cup of coffee? Here, sit down. What do you need?" So she's just really befriending
Right.
the threat, right?
You hear of women who get kidnapped who do this. They fawn, um, and it eventually. I mean, some of their attackers have let them go, thinking they've made friends with the woman that they have been abusing.
Hmm.
And then of course the woman escapes off to safety and all that stuff. But it is crazy, like that we've gone so long not acknowledging this as a legitimate response because then a lot of people you see, well, why didn't she fight back? Why didn't she do this? And it's like her nervous system like actually just isn't wired that way for whatever
Right.
reason.
And that's the thing with all of these trauma responses. Now, I know we were just talking about how we don't want to use it as a crutch, but
Right.
just to say it happens so automatically
Yes.
that I heard Adam Young. I really appreciate his podcast for trauma, but he says like when something like this happens, you end up like pleasing, or it's like, why couldn't I stand up for myself? Or why did I end up agreeing with this person that I do not agree with at all? Or
Right.
where does my need to be liked come from? That's all related to the fawn trauma response. But instead of shaming ourselves, Adam Young would say, like, that's where you tell your nervous system, good job. You're
It did what
doing.
yes, it's doing what it's
Mhm.
supposed to do.
Mhm.
Right.
So we see lots of, codependency, right? That, there's somebody that's harming me, but I'm just gonna help them. I'm just going to be nice to them. I'm just gonna win them over. So
Right.
these are all ways that the fawn trauma response is showing up. And then it shows up in, this is what's difficult. It will show up in faith-based circles, right? And it will just be like, "Oh, we just have to obey," very different than the virtue of obedience that's done out of freedom,
Right. Not coercion.
not coercion, not out of a need
Yes.
to stay safe. So it's just whatever they say, whatever you want. Even sometimes, okay, I could go on,
No,
but
go
even
for
in
it.
our relationship with God, We can
Yeah.
have a fawn response, whatever you want, God. Now that's confusing because really isn't the perfection of charity, holiness, union with God's will, but that comes from a free response of yes versus a compliant, whatever you want, God, whatever you want, God, whatever he wants to keep him
Right.
happy.
So it's a lot about being attuned to your interior disposition. So how do
Mm-hmm.
we cultivate more of an awareness of in that? Because as you alluded to earlier, we're constantly consuming, and whether that's food, whether that's music, whether that's podcasts, YouTube channels, whether it's movies, or alcohol or drugs, whatever it is. I mean, it's like we're constantly pacifying ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like people are afraid of silence because in the silence we know ourselves. We're
Yeah.
confronted with those deep interior thoughts that we have, and but it's also in the silence where we meet God. And so how do we encourage people? How would you encourage people to cultivate that in their lives so that they can be more aware of the inner workings of their heart?
Well, first of all, you have to find time in your day to intentionally pause. I mean, when we're moving so fast, we're not thinking about what we do. Like the week comes and goes, we never gave it a second thought that we binge watched Netflix or ate
Mhm.
a half a pan of brownies. We never give anything a second thought. So the first thing is really just pausing. Pause and look at your day, look at your week, look at the amount of time you're spending on social media. And then it's out of that place is curiosity. So we heal in curiosity and kindness. So the way that we're asking the question, like, gosh, I wonder why I do what I do versus why do I always do that? Right. so
Yes. Yeah.
so making sure that the voice of curiosity is really one of like, but I actually want to know.
Mhm.
St. Paul says it was the kindness of God that led us to repentance.
Mm.
So it's curiosity and then it's compassion. So I just can't say this enough. We can't heal in the presence of shame and judgment. So judgment being, why do I do that? Shame meaning I got to get better.
Yeah.
Curiosity says, I wonder why I do that. How can I heal? How can I be all that God wants me to be?
Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah, my priest last confession, he's like, I don't really ask so much like why or with judgment. I don't look at with people's behaviors with judgment anymore. And he's like, you should do that. You should look at what you're doing, and instead of because like some of the these I was confessing, he's like, this is like really interesting confession. And he's like, I think we have to practice less judgment about
Mhm.
why you're doing those things and just ask like, what is it that keeps bringing me to doing these things, or why do I think even that that's sinful? Because is it really sinful, or is it touching on a wound that you have? And I was like, oh my goodness. Because and then he goes, because here's the reality is you just can't be all things to all people. And I was
Mhm.
like, yeah, yeah. And that's another thing too, is I think sometimes we misapply and we think we're not doing enough, we're not being good enough, and we say like this certain behavior, we're judging it as sinful. Like, for example, if I don't feel like I'm spending enough time recreating with my children, for
Mhm.
example. And so I internalize that because and so I think I'm failing or I'm doing something bad by not doing more of that. And my priest is like, you just can't you have 6 kids and your oldest is 10. He's like, you're cleaning, you're cooking, you're homeschooling, you're doing these things. He's like, why do you feel like that's a sin? And I didn't really think about it. Like, I don't know, why do I feel like I'm doing something sinful when I can't recreate as much as I would like to with my kids? That's an interesting thing because it really all of a sudden I'm realizing, oh, that's a wound that I have. That's not about me being negligent or something, which is how I internalize that behavior. There's something different going on here that I need to address. You know what I mean? Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what was kind of the core of it. And I was grateful that he said, you got to stop judging your behaviors and start asking why.
Yes. Yeah, and that's really sometimes our inner critic and that high expectation we can
Yeah.
confuse with the voice of God, right?
Yeah.
Well, if I'm expecting this of myself, God must be expecting this of me, and then I'm falling short, and now it's a sin,
Right.
right? And so even and why do I have such high expectations of myself? Like, where does that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And that question, one question that's always helpful to ask is like, what am I afraid would happen if dot 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 if I stop scrolling through Facebook, if I stop judging myself, if I stopped having such high expectations, what am I afraid would happen? And usually there we can find like the wound, the core belief, the vulnerable part that we're working so hard to keep safe.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just processing that because it's like, wow, how many of us are just afraid we might actually like ourselves, or we might realize um that we're wrong about our own perception, or you know what I mean, or like where those wrong perceptions came from, because then you have to confront, why do I have those perceptions about myself? Which is a whole nother layer. What do you think that surprises the most people when they come through a retreat? Like what are the things that they tend to be surprised by when they start doing the work, I guess?
That's a good question. I think there's just greater self awareness, like we've been talking about, like surprise, like, why do I do what I do? Why am I latching to this person or this idea or this? I mean, we have trauma bonds, relationships. So, like, so usually there's just like this huge revelation, and the work is only beginning once they leave grief to grace, right? It's
Right.
just it's the beginning because of this revelation. But there's another part of like for me, so I shouldn't say everyone, but for me, it was I often think that my external world is what's holding me back, and usually it's me.
It's your interior world. Yeah.
Yeah, and so,
Mm.
coming up with limiting beliefs about yourself, limiting beliefs about God, and again, like, these are all formed with your little inner child, from trauma, but really, really understanding, like, your potential, your capacity, who you're called to be in Christ, not just his follower, but someone who shares him with others with your own unique charisms and gifts, and to really be free to be a self gift. So I think our limiting beliefs and behaviors that keep us from being all that we were called to be. There's one exercise on Grief to Grace where everybody carries a rock. And again, I'm not sure if I'm revealing too much of the retreat, but it's like this
Yeah.
symbol of my burden, right? My thing that's keeping me, and it's cumbersome to hold and to carry and to keep with my workbook and to bring into my room, and I have to hold it. And yet it becomes so familiar. Like, I love my burden.
We do. We love our burdens.
We love it.
It's so, yes, isn't that such a fascinating thing? And we sort of begin to identify with our burdens. And so,
And it's
um,
my burden. It's mine. I want to keep it. There's something, yeah, we identify, we hold it too closely.
mhm. How do we, as we begin to heal, how do we maintain progress without, I mean, because grieving is not it's not linear. And I think too, we're talking about grief and trauma like they're separate, but the reality is that when you are healing from trauma, there is a lot of grief involved.
Mhm.
Um, and so how do we make progress in that healing? Because sometimes it might even feel like we're going backwards a little bit.
And that's just where, like, we really need people to accompany us, because it can just be like, once we're going through it, like, what's going on? And that inner critic takes over, like, why am I still like this? So whether it's
Right.
friends who are doing their own work, have done their work, a Christian therapist, spiritual director, to really stay connected to people, because we're not meant to heal in isolation. Because the
Right.
temptation is going to be to stop, and sometimes we do need to stop, but um like, I'm doing this wrong, so it's just somebody to validate, like, yeah, this is
Right.
messy and it's okay.
how can you know that when you've like attained a level of healing where it's like, I don't know, because I feel like it could be a lifelong process, but I would be afraid of people just getting stuck in their healing. Like, what are the biggest obstacles people face in their healing where maybe they get stuck on something? I mean, do you ever see that
You
where
can
people
get
sort of get stuck and they're not really making any progress at all?
Yes, stuck in that, I see this in my spiritual directees, it's like, what's motivating your need for healing? Is it
Mm.
actually your own shame and perfectionism? I need to get past this scrupulosity. I need to get over this heartache. I need to be done, and then I'm somehow perfect, right?
Mm.
So we can get stuck when our healing is motivated by shame, and then it becomes a little idle. I need to work on this. I need to get better. I need to this. I need to. So that's where I think we can get stuck. And then it can become our identity. Well, I
Right.
struggled with infertility. I struggled with miscarriages. I struggle with anxiety, right?
It's
And
kind of like how people with same-sex attraction will say, I'm a gay man or I'm a gay woman.
Mhm.
And it becomes a part of their identity, like their sexuality becomes the pinnacle of their identity instead of saying, oh, I'm someone who struggles with same-sex attraction or this is an experience that I have. Does that kind of
Yes, yes,
correlate?
yeah. So
Where it's like I'm an anxious person or I'm a depressed person or whatever, and it feels like then that becomes the identity and like everything centers around that. You're right. It becomes this idol. I've
so
never thought of it that way.
that's how we become stuck
Yeah.
is when everything is centering around it. And so that's why we have to make sure that healing is not out of shame to be better, but really to say like, I want to move towards freedom.
Yeah.
And that's where we can really start to grieve so that we can surrender, the feel, heal, and deal.
Mm. So where can people go to Grief to Grace retreats? I know of one person who has spoken very, very highly. I interviewed him, I don't know, a long time ago now, a year and a half ago or something. He was a survivor of sexual trafficking as a
Wow.
childhood trafficking. Really interesting, but he raved about the retreats. It was like one of the first things that he felt like helped him make progress in this journey that he was on. But where are Grief to Grace like retreats held? And how can people get plugged into what you guys are doing?
So I think the national website, I think it's just grieftoggrace.org. And then that's where our listeners who may be listening from across the country can find different locations. If we have guests in the Minnesota area, grieftogracemn.org is where you can find a list of the Minnesota retreats.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this today. I think this was just such a wonderful interview, and I'm glad that we were able to really dive deep into some of these different aspects that I think are really overlooked when we're talking about grief and trauma work. So thank you so much, Kristin.
You're welcome, Angela.
God bless you.